Now ask Councillor Thabo Manyoni, who is the Executive Mayor of Mangaung Municipality and also the Chairperson of the South African Local Government Association, SOGA, for those who are not South Africans, otherwise we know it. Thank you very much. He's going to introduce our session.
Why the applaud? I haven't even started committing mistakes as usual and so on. But nonetheless, thanks very much, Philip. I don't know whether it's a surname, it's a name, Philip, Harrison, Philip. Acceptable. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously my job is very simple. I'm just going to be a chair. It means that I have the right to tell you that the session is over. So please, that relies on me. And so we do not take much of your time. But I think it is quite important for all of us to say, when we are looking into this relationship, Brics and us Brics or Brics in general, what basically are we saying when it comes to matters pertaining to safety, violence, particularly in those countries? But I think what is quite important in our context, it's when we say we are building an Africa that we want in relation to Agenda 2063. Obviously, I think we all will agree that we want an Africa free of violence, a safe Africa. And if that then be the case, I think in our terminology and language that we are using daily, when it comes to matters of cities, metros, we have to seriously ask ourselves the question, is safety included in this regard? For instance, let's take, we always, all the time, talk about resilient cities. Are we including matters pertaining to safety there? We talk about smart cities. Are we also looking into how then we turn that smartness into turning our habitats, spaces to be safe? We always talk about inclusive cities. Does that also include matters pertaining to safety? I must indicate from experience that we have when it comes to matters of planning. In most cases, we have planned our cities in such a manner that they become exclusive. And by being exclusive, we think we are bringing safety element in. The unfortunate part is, all the time, we are making sure that people are excluded in becoming part of livelihoods. And therefore, no one can be able to protect nor defend each other because we are exclusive in our planning. And we have accepted the advices that we are getting on matters of planning as God-given, and we don't necessarily question the element of violence and safety in planning our spaces as cities. And given the fact that nowadays matters of safety are becoming quite important, we have seen all the attacks and so forth, I think it is quite important that in our dialogue we bring this element of safety in whatever we do in our sphere of life. And I think if we will do that, we will then be able to add into the type of Africa that we want. Today we've got experts, professors, managers, practitioners who are in this field, who are going to share with us ideas and maybe assist us to have some kind of ideas that we also will take to our cities in terms of building their livelihoods. And I think when we talk about livelihoods, obviously we talk about spaces where there is safety, peace, happiness. And in terms of South African NDP, I think your Vision 2030, that's what it is striving for. And those livelihoods are spaces where people can enjoy and own and feel that they are inclusive. They also are included. I would like to take this opportunity today to introduce some of our key speakers here. Most of them are professors, unfortunately. And I think they will really be able to guide us in this journey of building the future, the Africa that we want. You are welcome, and Professor, you are welcome, Dr. Maharaj. You all are welcome. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much to the Honourable Mayor. And in fact, to talk about Brics cities and African cities is to talk about learning networks that help us deal more effectively with issues such as safety, such as livelihoods, such as economy. And so those are some of the key themes we need to think about as we talk comparatively across a number of important cities in the world. So welcome to the session. I'm really grateful to be given a role in this session. It's something quite close to my heart. Building networks of learning across cities in the world, across countries in the world. I've really only of course I must say thank you to the session conveners, to the Executive Mayor, to our partners, the South African Cities Network. I'll come to that, to our rapporteurs and so on. But there's one person I particularly want to say thank you to. I don't know if she's in the room. Kumal Sela. Thank you very much. She's done this wonderful job in putting together 5 of the sessions. You can imagine how stretched she's been. And we didn't make it easier because I was traveling with 2 of our speakers in China, in fact, developing partnerships with Brics cities, and communication was extremely difficult, and somehow she managed to put it together. So thank you very, very much, Kumal, for doing that. This also brings together a partnership, various partnerships. We're co-convening with the South African Cities Network because we have a project to put together information on the top 30 Brics cities. I have a partnership with provincial government, in fact, to write a book on Brics cities. And we're seeking new partners, and we're very excited to know there are other people doing research on Brics cities. But we're not only talking about Brics cities, we're talking very specifically, because there's an Africities conference. The focus of this conference is cities in Africa. So we're talking about Brics cities, the big cities in India, in China, in Russia, in Brazil. We're talking about them in relation to Africa. We're talking about the networks, the relationships between cities in those countries and cities in Africa, and how through building those relationships we can strengthen both our knowledge and our practice in responding to these massive challenges and opportunities that we confront in relation to urbanization. So someone said to me when I said we're having a Brics city session, they said, but academics like saying this, but is Brics an analytical category? You're just mushing a whole lot of cities together. And of course, in a sense, Brics is not really an analytical category. I don't know if you know, who knows where the term Brics comes from? Heard of Jim O'Neill? Worked for Goldman Sachs, and he invented the term, was then BRIC, because there was no South Africa, in 2001. And he talked about a grouping of countries outside the recognized global core with high potential for future economic growth on the basis of the size of their economies and their population and their growth performance. So clearly China, India, Brazil then was going through a decade of rapid economic growth. When you asked in 2010 whether South Africa should be a BRIC, he said, no, definitely not. And at one level, of course, he's right. If we're really looking at South Africa versus Brics countries, although we think we should really be thinking of South Africa in relation to Africa and Africa in relation to the Brics. That's the real comparison. So China has a population which is 27 times bigger than South Africa's. Its economy is 23 times bigger. So we're just a tiny minnow. But what is important is not so much the comparisons in terms of size. What brings the Brics together is a geopolitical rationale. And I'm just quoting an academic who said, an alternative and equally valid way to approach the analytical question might be to ask whether the Brics countries form a set, not because of their size, but because they have a similar type of influence in and equivalent implications for the international economic or political system. Do they alter the conditions of interactions with other players, whether states, firms, or international organizations, in parallel ways? In this latter sense, the set of Brics economies or Brics countries may have merit as an analytical category. So you see, I'm an academic, so I have to defend the fact that I'm talking about BRICS cities. So we can study the BRICS not because they're the same as each other, but because they're a collective of countries that offer an alternative to the politically and still intellectually dominant global north. It doesn't mean that there are no material comparabilities. If we look at per capita income, not the size of the economy, South Africa has a per capita income a little higher than China's per capita income. So there's a comparability in terms of levels of development. If we look at our environmental impact per capita, it's very similar, for example. And it's not only in similarity that we find interest and that we can learn, it's also in relation to difference. And the BRICS, in fact, are both similar as middle-income countries, but also different in really interesting ways. And by bringing the similarities and differences together, we can have a really meaningful conversation. So why are we then having a discussion on BRICS cities? I just want to mention 4 or 5 points. The first one I've already made. There's real value in both looking at diversity and commonality. And we can really gather significant insight into our own context by looking at our context from somewhere else. That's the first point. The second point is because the BRICS, together with Africa, will be the focus of most of the overwhelming proportion of the world's predicted urban growth until 2050. And we need to understand these countries far better than we currently do. Do you even know the top 10 largest countries in China or in India? So the name's perhaps not even familiar to us. 90% of the new urban growth until 2050 will be in Asia and Africa, and the bulk of that will be in the middle-income countries in Asia and Africa until 2050. Beyond 2050, what's now the lower-income countries will probably account for the bulk of urban growth. So if we're going to understand urbanization, we have to understand what's happening in the BRICS, also what's happening particularly in middle-income countries in Africa. The third point is the relationship between the BRICS and Africa. It's a complex relationship. It's something we have to explore. It's not a simple relationship. So you know there's a critique, for example, that Africa is a continent that offers a lucrative source of raw materials, oil and minerals for the BRICS, and there's a strong critique actually about the role of the BRICS in Africa. But the Economic Commission for Africa gives some really important advice. The Economic Commission for Africa says we can leverage the advantage, the attraction that Africa has for the BRICS, for Africa's advantage, if we maximize the linkages, the backward and forward linkages between the extractive industries and build industry around those linkages. And so if we manage the relationship properly, we can really leverage sustainable development, continental, urban, rural development through the relationship between the BRICS. But it's a key area for engagement, something we can't be naive about. We really need to understand properly what is the nature of that relationship. And then just a fourth point before I will shut up. The fourth point really is that we've made considerable progress in terms of national engagements. The BRICS structures, for example. The G77 plus China. National engagements. At a national level, knowledge networks, political networks, economic relationships are being established. And these political relationships are gradually, maybe more rapidly, being transformed into real sources of innovation and development. You know about the new development bank, the BRICS Development Bank that's been established. It offers all sorts of enormous possibilities. And that comes through multilateral engagement between countries. But city-to-city connections, although there are some sister-city relationships, but city-to-city connections are still underdeveloped. So even as our political bosses are building those relationships at a city level, as city government, as academics in city-based universities, we can also be building those relationships and linkages and really translate those partnerships into something really, really meaningful. So we think that there is some very strong reasons why we should put Brics cities on the agenda in relation to cities in Africa. Fortunately, we've got, and my great thanks to the speakers who've been brought together at late notice. And so all of them have got wonderful CVs, but I don't want to take up the whole afternoon telling you what great speakers we have. Just believe me, we have got some really wise people who are going to be talking to us. So this is the order. Margot Rubin, I'll tell you what they're doing now, is a senior researcher at Wits University. She's recently completed her doctoral degree, doing some very interesting comparative work between India and South Africa, so the Brics connection. And she's working together with me in our research unit, and we're going to be focusing very strongly on the relationship between Brics cities. And so Margot will give us a comparative view of cities across the Brics countries. And then I've only today met Jade Gibson. Jade's over there. And she has an extraordinary, very interesting CV. And what it does is bring together a whole range of worlds into really interesting combinations. So she's an artist. She's a writer. She's recently published a novel. She's an urban researcher, but not only an urban researcher, she researches across a range of disciplines. So I look forward to seeing how she can weave all this together in a presentation on the Brics. Dr. Yang Yan is sitting there, and she'll be talking to us about China, and she holds this interesting transnational position between South Africa and China, living across two worlds, understanding both cities in Africa and cities in China, and can interpret Chinese cities for us and interpret African cities for colleagues in China. And she's a research associate with the Wits Cities Institute, and is also a researcher with the South African Cities Network, working on a Brics-related project. And then the next presentation will be from Rasigan Maharaj. I've also just met him, who is the Chief Director of the Institute for Economic Research on Innovation at Tshwane University of Technology. And what I'm excited about is that he has been involved in Brics-related work from the very beginning of the Brics. So we are Johnny-come-latelys. Okay. We've discovered the Brics and we're interested in looking at the relationships, but he's been working then since Jim O'Neill declared the idea of the Brics. He's been working on the Brics, and he'll be able to reflect on a long experience, 15-year experience of researching the Brics. And then my old friend Rashid Sidat, I think he's known to many of you, and Rash is the head of the Gauteng Planning Commission, so he has a very particular responsibility in terms of relating this city region in which we're located now to city regions in other parts of the world, and in building those learning networks. And obviously many of those city regions, some of the biggest city regions of the world, sit in Brics countries. And so I think it's very exciting that we're beginning a partnership also between the university and provincial government around trying to understand a lot better the nature of those relationships. And so we look forward to what Rash has to say in relation to that. And I think Eric Appelgren, has he arrived? Eric, yes. And so he's doing something similar to Rashid in a different South African context in eThekwini municipality, one of our big metros, if you're not familiar, the city of Durban and neighboring cities. And he's the head of international relations in the city of eThekwini. So again, it's his particular responsibility to build those linkages, and he has experience in building those linkages, and I'm sure he'll reflect on that for us. So those are our speakers, and so I don't have to introduce them again. So we have 3 tasks this afternoon. One is to listen and learn, hear the presentations. We'll have opportunity for discussion, so it's to speak, and we're a small enough group for everyone to be heard. And then we're also requested to suggest resolutions that will go forward into the Africities process. Now, we don't have to do that, but if it makes sense to propose a resolution around perhaps the way in which African cities can participate in the Brics Urbanization Forum, for example, then let's do that. Let's take that forward. It's within our remit and the Executive Mayor, our Chair, will assist in that regard. So there it is. This session is concerned with the changing position and nature of large cities in the Brics. It's concerned with putting Brics urbanization in a comparative perspective. It's concerned about the connections between Brics cities, people, economy, and ideas. It's concerned about the possibilities and challenges that these connections bring, and very significantly, then it's concerned about the commonalities and differences between Brics cities and African cities, and the relationships between Brics and African cities. And Dr. Margot Rubin will help put all of this in perspective to give us a comparative view across the Brics and Africa. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Finally, we're on our way after a few technical hitches, but it's lovely to be up here. I've got two tasks for this afternoon. The first is to deepen the conversation that Phil started around the similarities and differences that exist between Brics cities, and starting to give some content to that particular idea, and what we mean by these similarities and differences, how they exist, and what they actually look like in material form. The second point is then the question around, well, how do we study these things? How do we study these different kinds of cities given the similarities and differences? And putting on the table this idea of a Brics Plus City Lab as an idea or as an instrument by which we can actually start to study the different cities across Brics, plus the different cities within the African and other contexts, which would make sense in terms of studying these different kinds of ideas. So what I'm going to begin with is basically an analysis, oops, I should hope so. There we go, of what to think about when thinking about the interesting similarities and differences between the different kinds of cities themselves within the Brics context. And I think the place to start off is to start to think about the different urban systems within each of the Brics countries themselves, and how different they are initially, both within, when looking at cities within each national context and across the different contexts themselves. And what becomes absolutely fascinating is the scale, as a question mark, between the different kinds of cities themselves and different countries. So where we start to have a look that South Africa has 10 cities which are between basically 300,000 and about 4 million, or 5 million, sorry. What we have is somewhere like China, which has almost 400 cities which fall within these categories. So we start to see immense differences within the different kinds of urban systems. And then even within that, there are massive differentials. So Brazil, for example, has 35 smaller cities, but only one supersized city. Russia, even more interestingly, has 50 small cities, but no supersized cities and only one really mega city. So we start to see that there are some very interesting differences within the urban systems that exist. And it starts to raise interesting questions for us as to exactly why this happens. Why does the Russian Federation have so many smaller cities, but not many in the larger categories? What are the processes around that have determined that particular urban system in place? So these are some of the things that we start to come up as questions when we look comparatively and also within the different national contexts themselves. Then if we were to look at it slightly differently in terms of rating, and also to answer to a slightly different question, which is where does South Africa fit into this whole story, is if we were to look at the super cities, cities over 20 million people. And I've just recently had the experience of being in Shanghai with the almost 24 million people. My research itself was in Delhi with 25 million people. We start to see these are the super cities. These are the massive cities, the ones which are, have these huge populations. And for the most part, they're in India, China, Brazil, not in the Russian Federation and not in South Africa. If we go down the list and have we look, where does South Africa fit in? How do we take part in this particular story? Well, if we were to just look at population, for example, Johannesburg does compete, or rather the central Witwatersrand area does compete, and certainly sits very comfortably within this category over here. of large cities, sitting with about 9.5 million people. So we start to see that if we were to analyze where the different urban systems sit comparatively, there are huge, massive megacities, super cities, over 20 million people, significant, very important cities within their own context. Then we're getting this growth of the megacities, and then these large cities, which are kind of more spread within the Brics nations themselves. Okay. But that's basically population. That's one way of looking at it, is just to rank these cities, thinking about how big they are in terms of actual numbers of people. If we start to take a slightly different index, and what we were to do is to take population and economy and to mix them, then we get a slightly different ranking system in terms of understanding how the cities relate to each other. So if we were to take both the economy and the population, what we start to see is Shanghai comes out as the first city with a massive population and an incredibly powerful economy. Sao Paulo comes next, interestingly enough, where if we were to take the way that we've ranked it, it doesn't sit at first in either, but as a combination of the two. We start to see that it's very, very important. It sits at third, Delhi fourth, again, and various other cities as we go through. But what we start to see, of course, is that the different kinds of indices that we use, different kinds of indicators rather that we use, give us different kinds of rankings when we start to look comparatively across the cities. So population is just one, economy is certainly another. When we combine them, we get a third kind of ranking. And what this starts to point to is how we deal with the data around Brics cities themselves, and how we start to understand their relationships to each other and to different kinds of data sets and information. Okay. This is actually, for me, one of the most interesting of the different kinds of ranking systems that we've been able, well, not ranking, sorry, information that we have around Brics cities themselves. And what this points to is how the cities have changed, or the rankings have changed over time from 1950 to 2015. And for me, some of these are absolutely fascinating. For example, the fact that Delhi was 51st, was ranked 51st by population in 1950, come to 2015, it's second. I mean, it has gone through ups and downs, as you can track over time. By 1980, it was 20th, and moved 31 places, and it's landed up at the second place. Once again, we start to ask questions around why is that? What is going on that we start to see these huge transitions, huge changes in some cities? Whereas if we were to look at Johannesburg, for example, starting off at 36, going to 43rd during the height of apartheid, and then in 2015 landing up at 34th. So actually not having moved significantly, if you were to just take 1 point to the second as 1 point to another, only having moved 2 places in the ranking over population. Once again, asking seriously interesting questions. But perhaps for me the most fascinating is Shenzhen, which was ranked 1,576th, good Lord, in 1950, and is now ranked 25th. And effectively what it's done is it's gone from a small fishing village, okay, into a huge city, into a massive conurbation. So once again, what has been the urban policy, or what has happened within these processes to allow for such an enormous change over time? So these are the kinds of things that we find interesting when starting to think about Brics cities themselves, when starting to think about the comparative notion of looking at the different kinds of cities. How have they moved? Why have they moved? What have been the policies and the ideas that have promoted this kind of movement? We're going to go into that. But of course, very importantly, not all countries and not all cities in these countries are equal. If we were to just have a look at the national level for a minute, just to zoom out for a second, if you look at it in terms of the GDP of Brics, China takes up a massive, almost 60%. Huge. South Africa, 2%. So here we start to get to some of those important differences within these different contexts themselves. Russian Federation and India, Brazil, closer to each other, 14, 13, 12% respectively. So we start to see that there are these huge differences, but also within that, you get these subcategories of similarities as well. Quite interesting. Let's move on. Then if we go back to urbanization rates itself, we start to see some very interesting differences. Now, when O'Neill was busy writing in the early 2000s, some of these trends weren't as apparent as they are now. and certainly some of them have become more apparent over time. But what we start to see in terms of urbanization is where some of the countries sit and where they've come from and gone to. So for example, India, which is the other context I'm most familiar with, has started off at a very low base of urbanization and hasn't gotten past more than 30% urbanization rate, which still means that at the moment, almost 65% of the population in India is still sitting in the rural areas. So, which is quite different, for example, to Brazil, which is sitting in the over 85% category, to Russia, which is in the over 75% category. So we start to see that they are very, very different in terms of the urbanization rates. But because India's population is so enormous, it starts to be able to be comparative in terms of the actual numbers, because we have huge numbers of people living in cities, even if they constitute only a very small percentage of the national population themselves. And what this also starts to tell us is some of the history of urbanization in these various contexts. So of course, when we have a look at the South African one, what we start to see is very flat. Sorry, it's this. There. Okay. The South African urbanization, we can start to see very clearly the influence of urban policy, the influx control regulations which stop people moving in. And then, of course, in 1990s, when some of those policies started to fall away, there's kind of dammed up energy, this dammed up urbanization. Ooh, no, that's quite fine. Which then, of course, led to huge kind of urbanization in quite a short period of time. So once again, when looking at these things comparatively, we can start to see where the different countries have ended up, what has been the influence of history, what has been the influence of policy and politics on urbanization within these different contexts themselves. And then, but what about some of the similarities? Well, we start to see similarities, enormous similarities around a range of different kinds of indicators. Inequality is a key one. And we start to see that in many of the contexts, Brazil and South Africa, for example, share very high Gini indexes, very high similarities in context of inequality across these different contexts themselves. But that's not all. There are other kinds of measures which start to tell us about the similarities between the Brics cities themselves. Very importantly, particularly amongst the larger cities, is the contribution and the role they play in the national economies. For example, the GDP of Shanghai is $338.5 billion US dollars, which is bigger than Singapore and Hong Kong put together. Okay, thanks. Mumbai is dollars. Also, we start to see that these particular contexts, all of them attract huge numbers of migrants, both internal migrants and cross-border migrants. Sao Paulo, 8% of the population are migrants. Shanghai increases 350,000 people per annum. Delhi and Mumbai have 43% of their populations are migrants. Moscow, 20% of temporary populations. So we start to see that there's some interesting comparisons, economic comparisons, population comparisons, that do exist between the different cities. Environmental challenges, crime, safety, poverty, all of these things. I won't go into detail. Other things in terms of urban form, urban fragmentation, represented in a number of different ways. Sao Paulo on the right, looking at areas of vulnerability. Johannesburg in terms of racial mix. Spatial inequity in Delhi and in Indian cities, and then the population spread between the core and the periphery in Moscow. So we start to see different kinds of similarities. Informality, another key feature that is certainly common to almost all of the different cities in one way or another, both in terms of housing and also in terms of economy itself. So how and why would we study the Brics cities? What does it offer us? Well, I think Professor Harrison has already started to answer that question, but just to give a bit more detail to it. Certainly a key idea that's going on in academia at the moment around new comparative urbanism. How do we start to compare? How do we start to think about different cities? And the one idea is that we also need to start constructing knowledge from the south. We can't just accept knowledge from the north. We start to need to think about it and theorize what's happening from the south about the south. We also need to start to think not only about outcome but about process. As Professor Harrison indicated, we also have an institutional lack which is starting to inspire this. We have very few city-to-city relationships which we need to think about. Not to mention, once again, most of the urban growth is going to be in these areas. It's going to be in Africa and it's going to be in the Brics regions. So we need to And there's something very interesting about the energy that's gone in many of these contexts. There's much to learn from each other. There's much to be gained from the innovation that does exist. Sao Paulo has got fascinating ways of dealing with land ownership and speculation. Could we apply that to South Africa? I think that's an open question. So, what are we doing is, well, we're basically proposing, us and a number of partners, a city lab, which would be to look at how we would support the idea of rapid urban growth in these regions in a number of different ways. I can't go into too much detail because I have about 2.5 minutes left. But the idea is to basically establish a transnational learning network across key cities with Brics or MICs being middle income countries, and direct a network towards the challenges and imperatives of governance in large cities. How do we understand the challenges of governance? How do we understand the issues of urban governance? What are the suggestions we can make? And what we're thinking of doing, what we're trying to do, is create a network with a particular institutional form, linking a series of locally embedded institutions that essentially perform the function of local city labs in order to be able to give material understanding to the differences that I've tried to indicate. I'm not going to go into too much more detail other than to say it's going to involve, we're trying to ensure that it involves local partnerships, traditional academia, gangs, interdisciplinary work, and a key connection between both academic research and policy and applied research, and bringing these things together in order to see what lessons we can learn from the different contexts and how we can apply them. Also to ensure that there's kind of what we are referring to as a brain circulation. So taking some of the best minds, both in the academic environment and also in practice and also in bureaucracy, and putting them in touch with each other to communicate and connect with each other. We're also thinking of how we establish comparative research, both in terms of huge, big mega data sets, which the Chinese are very interested in, for example, but also in terms of the everyday functions of issues around the BRIC cities. How do we create platforms for engagement and some kind of youth lab? How do we train leaders of the future in terms of innovations and ideas that might be transferred from one context to the next? And we've gone quite far. We've developed a proposal, we've been taking it around, we've been thinking about it. We've recently had our first meeting with our partners in Shanghai, that was last week, which is why Professor Harrison, Dr. Young and I look a little jet-lagged, because we only came back on Friday after this discussion. But we got in principle agreement from a number of people from a number of contexts, and now we're in the really exciting phase of seeking funding to be able to actually drive this particular urban lab forward and see where it might take us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Margot. I think what we can do is just if there are a couple of questions of clarification or explanation, because we'll have the discussion later while Dr. Gibson is preparing to come up. Are there anything you need to? Was it clear? Yeah, it's crystal clear. Thanks. Great. Jess?
Okay, hello. Well, my slides are the ones that got eaten by the computer virus. They are now like this. So I'm going to have to ask you to use your imagination, which I'm sure you're all very good at. And just to start with, my presentation is on questions around material and symbolic flows between BRICS countries and BRICS collaboration. So what I'd like you to do first is to try to picture in your mind Brazil, Russia, India, China, and let's say Africa, because I'm looking from an African perspective. Picture these countries, or people from these countries in front of you, maybe holding hands, linking up as a unit. And maybe you saw families, maybe you saw men or women. You probably saw stereotypes of what China means to you, or India, what Africa means to you. So these are all cultural, symbolic, material ways of understanding what a country is in terms of people. So I'm trying to think here of how do we think of BRICS as a network, as a collection of people who connect across countries, across what we might see as divides. How do we actually work together? Because this is what BRICS is about. It's supposedly about finding ways to work together, despite differences, despite economic disparities, as Margot pointed out. it's about saying, what are the flows between people? How do they connect? What makes somebody take an idea from one place and bring it to another place, and then it takes off there? So those are the sorts of questions I'm thinking about when I talk to you. So first of all, I'd like to say, where do we stand now in terms of researching Brics? What collaborations are actually going on between the different countries that make up Brics in terms of academic research and what people are doing? Are they co-producing papers, bringing them out in publications? And yes, they are. In fact, there is a rise in the number of papers coming out across Brics countries overall, with China, since 2000, producing a vast number of papers, academic papers in public. And what's happening, though, however, is that this rise in papers has occurred in collaboration not just with Brics countries, but with countries around the world, and in particular Europe. So if you look overall at Brics countries and their rise in research output, they've all increased, but they've also increased in collaboration with each other, but increase in collaboration with other countries. So if you look overall, it kind of flattens out. But there is a great desire for Brics countries to work together. There's an economic desire, there are governments that are working very hard on this. And so this is just something to bear in mind. If we're going to start researching, working together on thinking what is the future of Brics, if it's going to operate as a network of flows between peoples, how is it going to be done? What could we look at? And just to bear in mind, there are theorists who talk about questions of how societies operate, how countries may connect, that have nothing to do with political borders or are separate from economies, but actually about how people themselves operate within economic frameworks and are part of these. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and there are theoreticians such as Wolff and Wallerstein who talk about a world system, for example, and questions around cities as sort of centres from which ideas spread from and grow and connect with other people. So perhaps we can start to do away with this idea of these separate countries in what I'm trying to look at here. So, and going through my invisible PowerPoints in front of you, there are a number of different cultural centres and research collaborations that are being set up, particularly in the last 5 years, between different countries. There's, for example, a workshop programme in astronomy between China and Africa. There's research on HIV vaccines between India and South Africa. There are, for example, cultural centres being set up, such as an Ethiopian cultural centre in India, opened in 2015. There's university connections between Chinese and Russian universities, for example. There's a collaborative research group of Africa and the Indian Ocean, which is happening. There are Chinese-Africa knowledge projects which go into history, pre-colonial history. There are various research institutes, China-African Research Institute. There's an India-African Forum Summit that's been happening since 2008. There's a Chinese and Africa agriculture and forestry research happening as well. So there are various new centres flourishing. So if you can picture that happening in your imaginary picture of these different countries starting to work together. And what I'd like to say is that, in particular, if you look at the outcomes, what sort of research is happening, you find, for example, that there are little blips of particular types of research. So between India and South Africa, there are engineering collaborations happening. Between Russia and China, there's a lot of collaboration, and that's probably because of their past socialist history as well, the history of actually connecting theoretically, intellectually. In medical science, strong collaboration between Brazil and South Africa, not surprising, with the development of generic drugs, HIV research. This is what's happening between those. But again, how are we going to strengthen these collaborations, and what areas do we need to also think about in terms of humanities, which is what my area is, and social sciences. But in the humanities, there have been peaks, and I think this is particularly in relation to questions around the Silk Roads, the pre-colonial histories of how China, India, Africa connected in the past, with trade routes. and with slavery, for example, between Brazil and Africa, these histories that have existed in the past. So there are various historical frameworks that are sort of re-emerging in the present with this interest in Brics in the present. So I'm just going to jump here into a sort of scenario where we can also think in a more interdisciplinary way. So let's think of something as simple as food. Food is cultural, food is families, food is what people eat. But if you think about this rapid urbanization that Marga's pointed out, these are vast numbers of people changing an entire lifestyle, a way of living from sort of more rural frameworks to a city framework, what you find is they eat differently. Now that might seem a simple concept, but what happens then is that with this eating differently, you have the increase of fast food consumption. So what you're finding is that certain very large fast food companies who have saturated Europe are now moving into countries such as India and Brazil. But also with this fast food consumption, you have a decrease in the sort of food people normally eat. So for example, in India, people are eating less rice. What does that mean? Farmers are going to produce less rice. So farmers now in rural areas are producing different forms of foods. And people are eating differently in the urban areas. What you're also finding, those with the fast food intake, is there's a huge rise in diabetes, in obesity-related disease, cardiovascular disease. So this then becomes a health problem as well. And with that, that's also happening in Brazil. This is an issue in Brazil where you start, now you're eating differently, the sort of family structure of eating together in Brazil starts to change because now you have a situation where people eat individually. So we're not talking about something that is just one tiny factor. And we can have lots of graphs and split this up into what's going on in food, what's going on in agriculture, what's going on in trade and consumption. But you can start to think, well, if we think about culture and we think about these different ways in which people live and how they change, we start to see a different picture. And what we're also having across Africa is China and Brazil being involved in agricultural projects, very large-scale agricultural projects across Africa. And so and China itself is also going through a problem of an increase in obesity and a change in dietary patterns. And what does that mean in Africa as well? So these are some of the questions that we need to think about. So I'm going to sort of jump here because I really have to sum up quite a lot. But there are other questions around urbanization, such as the lack of exercise. And then we have theorists such as Akiampong in Ghana who said, well, even the concept of sport and exercise is a Western concept. How do you rethink that in an African context? So can we perhaps think about some of the activities that people do in a different way when we research these? Now, when we have large-scale economic investment projects going on across, say, Africa from China and Brazil, we also have these rhetorics, these discourses that actually draw upon imaginaries of the past or connections in the past. So the Silk Routes is not just about, oh, this is what happened in pre-colonial Africa and pre-colonial China, India. This was a whole world that is now reconnecting in the present. So we're doing away with the West, where we're starting to form a new present that's based on a past. Brazil, for example, in the last 10 years has had a huge interest in investing economically in Africa, but has also reinforced and restated a sort of African diaspora connection with its own population and has taken a great interest in this connection through slavery, of slaves going from Africa to Brazil. India has an enormous diaspora. It's also part of, obviously, the Silk Routes in the past of trade. And there's 1.3 million people of Indian descent living in Africa alone. So if you start to think as well of the populations involved across these different countries, there's a large population in Guangzhou, is that how you say it, in China, of African temporary residents who formed a sort of mini city within the city in China. So what you're having as well is a history of migration, which I can't go into now, of people who've moved between and across these countries who are part of the way in which people are connecting today and forming ways of networks of connections. Because if you do business somewhere, you often connect with people you know. And this is how the economic side is also happening. Let's just think quickly around questions of health, traditional medicine. UWC, for example, has a BSc in traditional medicine, Chinese medicine and acupuncture, which you can do here and then become a doctor of Chinese medicine. And there are many centers or places of Chinese practitioners, Chinese medical practitioners across Africa that partly comes from doctors in the past being sent over to Africa, but also students going to study medicine in Africa. And Brazil as well has a strong traditional medicine component in its own health system. China's totally integrated this, and India has some awareness of traditional medicine as part of its own health system. And the question is, then what do we do with questions like traditional medicine, which is very different from the Western environment of health? And so how do we research questions like this about what does medicine and health mean in the present? And then what about the arts? Things like music, where you have connections between the Brazilian African sort of beats and Africa. Then you have the Brazilian music coming back, say, to Cape Town, where it was taken up again in sort of the jazz music in Cape Town in the past. There are the carnival in Cape Town, the minstrels carnival. They go out to China to buy their costumes, and then they came back and recreated a Chinese dragon, which they showed off in the sports stadium where they performed. So there is, it might seem a small thing, but what is this saying about the imaginaries of the 50,000 people who are involved in the minstrels carnival, for example, who see the Chinese dragon in their own carnival? Media. Nollywood, for example, everyone's heard of Nollywood. The Nigerian films, been incredibly successful, a huge source of economic, that's right, yeah, economic income for the country. And of course Bollywood from India, but also these have spread worldwide. You have Chinese people apparently buying Nollywood or watching Nollywood films now. You have a Bollywood consumption across South Africa on TV shown here. So these are very economically viable, artistic, creative modes of cultural expression, which I think we can also think about. How do we conceive of the arts as well? And how do we map? Okay, we have 1 minute, so just to round off, how do we map these connections? If you actually go to different websites across from African embassies and China, India, Brazil, and so on, you look at what they list as what's happening, you see very interesting things, such as a Russian chess champion going to Botswana and a team of young chess people being trained by this Russian chess champion in chess. Or the Russian ballet, for example, has come to South Africa recently. And what you see is a sort of cross exchange of cultural and artistic practices that are occurring between different countries. So on a small scale, again, that might seem very small, but what does it do if you see an exhibition and it's Chinese artwork, for example, in this country? So how do you start to map, and instead of doing a big map of economic flows and trade flows, perhaps cultural flows, symbolic flows, flows of ideas? What does that mean to the youth of today who are open in social media and the internet, who are open to new ideas and exploring different ways of expressing self? What does that say to an identity that is from a particular country, or what does it say to a notion of a Brics identity, if we're going to think about that? So in a very sort of roundabout and non-visual way, I've tried to get you to think carefully about perhaps the strong role that the arts, that humanities, that social science plays in, for example, economies, that they even use in the rhetorics of China and Brazil when they work with, say, Africa, that they also play a role in real economies such as Nollywood and Bollywood, that people are more receptive if they see themselves as having some sort of connection with peoples of other places. So that's why history becomes important. So I'm going to leave it there, and just to say, perhaps to think, how are you then going to think about how you research within this sort of Brics framework that has a strong economic drive behind it?
Thanks very much. That was really vivid. So you don't always need PowerPoint if you can speak in such vivid language. So perhaps while we're trying to get the technology sorted out again, maybe Margot, maybe we could get some assistance there. Let's just take some Any questions or points of clarity? A couple of minutes.
Or any thoughts?
Or any thoughts? We'll take thoughts later, but we can take thoughts now. But it's really making us think quite differently, because I think when we're in local government environments, we do think about the economically driven linkages. So to expand our thinking into the arts, into the humanities, I think has been really, really useful. Yeah, you'll be the next speaker. But, so I think we... Okay, we there? Thanks a lot. We'll come back to the discussion, but let's get in. You ready?
Good afternoon, everyone. You might think that I'm on the wrong panel to talk about China cities, but in the context of increasing links among the global south, between Africa and China, between Africa and the other Brics, it is time to understand each other's urban context better, as this connection will only become more and more obvious and stronger. Sorry, which one? Page down? This one. Okay, cool, thanks. China cities is part of our studies on the Brics cities at SACN. And I personally joined the Brics cities project led by Geshi at SACN in 2014. In 2015, we established our local partnership with Sachi Chair at Wits in producing fact sheets on the 30 largest cities across Brics, as a resource for more detailed comparative research that Margot and Fo were talking about. In this presentation today, I will give an overview of the contents of the fact sheets about the cities we selected before providing a brief scan of China's large cities. Finally, if there is still a little bit time left, I would like to touch base on the potential themes we could debate on in terms of the relation between Brics and the African cities. To give you some idea of what we are trying to do, here's the outline of a fact sheet. The first session dealt with the context of the city, but the second session gives really more detail on three thematic topics. First, public transport, green energy, and third, innovation-driven economic growth. Based on these fact sheets, we also aim at producing comparative reports on the three thematic areas. These are the cities we have selected thus far for the fact sheets. Because of the time limitation, I will only illustrate the studies on the Chinese cities here. So, first, some historical milestones to mark the expansion of economy in China. I don't know if you can see exactly the timelines, and in actually the first economic reforms introduced by Deng Xiaoping was in 1978, and in the 1980s, special economic zones set up in 5 areas where private firms allowed. This new wave of urban growth started in Shenzhen, the one that in Margot's slide you saw climbed more than 1,500 hot seats up to number 25. And then you'll see in the 1984 is actually, I'm just talking about this stretch for the moment, still here. 14 coastal cities opened up to foreign investment. And in 1989, Shanghai stock market reopens for first time in 40 years. 1997, Asian financial crisis, but the economy survived. 2001, China joins World Trade Organization. And 2005, and according to the data, private firms contribute more to Chinese economy than state-run sector. In 2011, China becomes world's second biggest economy with GDP at $7.2 trillion. In short, China's economic expansion accelerated dramatically in the 1990s as a result of massive privatization and the opening up to the country to foreign direct investment. Overseas firms rushed to build factories across China to take advantages of its low-cost labor. So as more and more factories have been built in China, the country has seen massive population transfer as tens of millions of migrant workers have left the countryside to find higher paid work in the cities. This in turn has created a new domestic retail environment with greatly increased demand for consumer products, further fueling the development and growth of urbanization. And this is the map of the major cities across China. Across China, the most rapid urban growth happened in the 90s and 2000, up 2000, starting in the coast areas where all the big cities sit, but expanding to the interior with the Go West policy after 2000. And growth has slowed significantly after 2010, recently. Then in most cities, with dramatic growth projections proving to be inaccurate, China enters the era which is now our government termed new normal. And here on this map, I don't know if, yeah, it's brown. The cities in brown dots are growing slower than the national average, and the cities in blue dots are growing faster. The point I want to make now and come back to at the end is that we can't only speak in general terms about cities in China. There is a lot of diversity at the moment. Some cities are growing, some are declining, some are highly international, some are linked to the domestic market. Some are based on old industries, some are new industries, some are service sectors. Population has been really concentrated during the reform period in the coastal cities, but now it is becoming more distributed. And the three major city regions in the coastal belt are the Beijing, Tianjin, sorry, can you hear me? Here is the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei city region. Okay. So here, like there's like a chicken, like China's map. So at the throat, really at the throat is our capital city. Around capital city is Tianjin, close to the sea. Thank you. And the province around is called Hebei. So there is one of the three important and largest city region in China. And then Shanghai, including the other 15 large cities in the city region, is also one of the important ones in China. And then the third one is around Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and the large cities now become large cities around Guangzhou, which is also the world factory, where all the manufacturing industry, where all our shoes and electric devices come from the world. Thanks.
I've been there.
Thank you. But at the same time, you also see some cities in the inland also developing, like Chengdu, Chongqing. Chengdu is just outside here. Chengdu, Chongqing. And Changsha is more in the middle south, yes, and up a bit Wuhan. And Xi'an, a little bit up, it's the brown dots. And Zhengzhou. Wuhan and Zhengzhou. So these are the inland cities. They are they rather individual than forming its city region around it. So far, Shanghai, Beijing, Chongqing, Guangzhou, Tianjin, Shenzhen are the mega cities over 10 million in China. Growth rates are still high in the three mega city regions. Shanghai and Hangzhou and Nanjing are in Yangtze River Delta, and they are still growing moderate fast, but not nearly as fast in the 1990s. I just want you to look at Shenzhen particularly. Margot also mentioned it grew at an extraordinary 32% per annum in the 1980s and it became the industrial workshop of the world. Today, however, it is hardly grow. It is struggling to adjust to new economic conditions, also because its role in the Pearl River Delta has to be balanced with Hong Kong, which is just over the strait. And there are just so many cities in China that I had to put them into 2 slides. And this has taken us to the 3.8 million mark, yeah? And just note 2 cities in this range. The first is Suzhou, which is growing at 6.3% per annum, which is challenging the core city of the Yangtze River Delta city region, Shanghai. And last week we took a fast train from Suzhou to Shanghai, so it took us about 20 minutes only. So you can imagine how close these 2 big cities located. So China's high-speed economic growth has substantially increased in the wealth of the country's population. This is particularly the case in cities, where factory workers' wages have risen strongly, giving them more disposable income measured by someone's income minus their personal taxes, while earnings in the countryside have lagged behind. People living in rural areas have still seen a marked increase in their disposable incomes. And this gap between urban and the rural leads to a large number of migrants in the city. What accounts for the difference between the de facto and official numbers of urban residents? Some scholars give an excellent breakdown of sources of the increase in the nominal urban population. According to his estimates, 15% is through natural increase, 43% through migration, and 42% through reclassification of rural areas into urban ones. And this is where we are at the moment, but I already described the scale and growth in the tables earlier. So currently, what we can say is China's urban growth are more in its inland regions due to industrial relocation and migration. Describing population is difficult as it depends on boundaries. Shanghai's municipal population is nearly 24 million, but it falls within a cluster of cities in Yangtze River Delta with over 100 million. If we take a city region perspective, the picture is very different. City region or the cluster becomes a key word in China's economic policy and urbanization strategy. In the coming 13th five-year plan. China has 3 of the largest agglomerations of cities in the world, as earlier we talked about. Each of these 3 big agglomerations account for around 10% of national population, meaning that 30% of China's people living in the super cities or super city regions. Chinese cities historically very dense, but now with large-scale new city development on the edges and massive sprawl into rural areas with cities swallowing villages, such as urban village phenomenon. City regions take different forms. The single core city like Xi'an and Chongqing in more inland part of China, the 2 poles of city region like Beijing and Tianjin forming Jing-Jin-Ji city region, and a cluster of many cities like in Pearl River and the Yangtze River Delta. The photograph here is the Pearl River Delta. It should tell us how hugely complex the spatial structure of the city region is, really like a spider web. And here's just an illustration to see how dense my hometown city Shanghai is. Only Hong Kong and Macau can really compete with it in China. So China's rapid growth in the reform era was driven by export-oriented manufacturing, but with the troubles in the global markets, China is reorienting towards the domestic market. This means that cities in the interior now also have an opportunity to develop, and the development and factories are being located like from Shanghai, from Beijing, from all the coastal big cities. And the other driver of city economies was real estate, but the great property bubble now seems to be over. But I'm not sure if it is. So this can be debated. There are also some cities, however, whose growth was driven by the tertiary sector, most importantly Shanghai, Beijing, which has become a world financial hub. Future drivers. So this is the next wave, China's new great spatial strategy, the Silk Road economic belt and the 21st century maritime Silk Road. Some cities in the interior will benefit from the overland route, which starts in Xi'an in the middle of China and head northwest to Urumqi. It's on the top of the map. And huge and cities on the south coast, Guangzhou and Xiamen, are the beginning of the coastal route. Huge state investment will be going into this. And the other big investment and economic driver is the high-speed railway network connecting cities across China. And within the city region, we're aiming at 1 hour's ride with a high-speed train. And between Beijing to Shanghai, it's like from Joburg to Cape Town, it is about 5 hours. So a third drive is foreign direct investment. Note how much is concentrated in Shanghai and the competing neighboring city of Suzhou in terms of the gross industrial output value above designated size. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, oh, sorry. Okay. So I will probably quickly just talk about this. China's formal system of city governments is hierarchical, but there has been a significant devolution of power to cities. And city governments performs most of the functions of national and provincial government, but at a lower level. No divisions of powers like South Africa. Some cities now have the status of provinces. We call the direct governed by the central government. And these are some of the key clusters that the Chinese government used as the new strategy for coordinating urban management, economic investment, planning, transport, and other infrastructure. Exactly how this can work is still not clear, so all our scholars, experts are trying to find solutions. So these are the official list of the cluster. And this is typical cluster plan, indicates how important coordination at the level of a city region is. This is for the Pearl River Delta, but excludes Hong Kong because it has different governance arrangements. So the major development challenges across China's cities, it's really hard to imagine the immense scale of building in China over the past 20 years. Local authorities and developers collude in this massive overbuild. And then the division between the resident population and the floating population, so-called migrants, still remains and is a source of real inequity in the cities. And the last point, if you visit Beijing in winter, you will really know what I mean by the environmental damage. And I don't think, do I have some time for thematic studies?
Come back to it a bit later.
Okay, we can come back to this a bit later. Shall I just leave it here? Or,
We can keep the slides on the screen, we can come back to it in discussion.
okay,
Take questions.
okay. So I don't have time to go to details, but if you're interested, we could go back to the slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yang Yan. So that's an introduction, I hope, to another world for many of us. Some of us have been to China, but still it's such a massive country with such diversity that going to Shanghai is not going to China. So are there any questions of clarity or information? Yes?
Just a quick one.
Maybe you want to just give your name and Yang Yan is for you.
My name is Zanoko Futwa. The western portion of the country seems to be lagging behind with regards to the concentration and the benefits of the growth. What has informed that?
What?
The western portion
Yes,
of the
yes.
country seems to be lagging behind
Yes,
with
yes.
regards to the benefits of the growth that has happened in the
Yes.
last 3 decades. What informs that?
Do you want to come to the microphone, please?
What's informed that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, interestingly, I was just in one of demographic conference in Shanghai, and they were talking about a line across how to say the country, that the to the right part of this line called Huhuanyong line, which is highly populated, and but on the other side, the left side is, you know, you never get people going there. So the key debate was, the key reasons that many scholars understand was the natural resources, because this line, the population line, people like to how to say, the natural conditions like the climate, and they don't get food from the land. The arable land is very limited, so you can never break this rule that although our premier, he was asking, okay, can we break this line? Can we break this rule that people always, you know, aggregating, going to the coastal areas? Can we build big cities and break this line? But to be more rational, it's not possible, because you will never get. You will put a lot of resources in building cities there. It's like you built eco city in the desert, that you don't get fruits, you don't get all this how to say, life substance there. So that's kind of how to say, history or of the nature or the conditions that making this rule.
Thanks very much. We'll take one more presentation. We're going to take 3 more presentations, but we're going to take one more presentation from the researchers, if you like. Then we're going to turn to government and get a response from government. So I know it's a long session, but they're relatively short, compact presentations. Rasi.
So thanks very much. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation. Thanks to the managers of this session for taking the risk of bringing someone from outside the community I think you generally work with, to share with you some thoughts about what we've learned by researching Brics. So I'm going to start by making a big point, and it's quite an important point, which I hope you'll see come through in the presentation itself. And that is that the way we approach Brics is not assuming that the Brics exist. Our approach to the Brics, and as I explained it to you, this may become a bit more clear, was about something that we wanted to establish. And I'll also maybe be sharing with you then in the process of this narrative, hope you don't mind, a countervailing theory. And this I will leave Goldman Sachs outside the door. We'll be talking about a process of development generated endogenously inside the constituents of Brics. Yeah, so not all of us were as influenced by the decisions in Wall Street to put us together into making a nice investment pot. And that investment pot was shut down a month ago, by the way, the Bric investment pot. So it's an easy outline we're going to go through. I know it's Monday afternoon, so there's not going to be huge amounts of substantive detail presented. Rather, I want to share by drawing from the cases. This is the work we've been doing over the last 15 years on Brics. Our starting point and why we came to the idea of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa working together was a notion around developmental metropoles that occupy a significant space in their neighborhoods. And that's what gave us the cut of China with East Asia, India with South Asia, Russia for Europe and the northern part of Asia, South Africa for Africa, and Brazil for South America. In framing it in that form, you can already get a sense of the approach that we take. My institute works on the critique of political economy. That's our background. So, whereas our friends, the economists, are generally known for their pessimism, our pessimism is much deeper. And I'm going to be sharing with you some critical points about the Brics, hopefully to push aside the hype and give us some parts that we can actually work with. So what we did over approximately from 2003 until last year, we studied how the systems of innovation, in other words, within these countries, how knowledge resources were being mobilized for the object of development. So our partners from China was the Chinese Academy of Sciences. From Russia, it's the Higher School for Economics, which is part of the academy system. Ourselves, in partnership with some of our science councils. In Brazil, a large network, largely linked with the development bank, called Red Assist. And in India, part of Jawaharlal Nehru University, the Center for Development Studies. And what we did was we composed teams that then studied, you'll see the subtopics, the role of the state. What role does the state play in development in the 5 countries? So these teams autonomously developed an appreciation for how history was being laid out within each of the 5 countries. We did the same about small and medium enterprises. And in this, I'm masking a lot of the differentiation. I hope to make a point about it later to help, I think, the colleagues that want to take Brics research forward as well. Metrics are very important. And what we call things, and because of that, how we measure it, becomes even more so. It's more than just culture and us using different scripts. Then we paid particular attention to the role played by transnational corporations and their impact on local enterprises. So as the colleague pointed out, there's a lot of focus on foreign direct investment. Our approach was not to see foreign direct investment leading to growth, but how local or national entities were able to absorb benefits from FDI. The FDI did not give that across. It was deliberately engineered through very direct policy mechanisms so that benefits could derive locally. The alternative is further deindustrialization. And this is an acute lesson that comes out of how we understand the role played by transnational corporations and their effect on local economies. We also looked at how innovation was being financed in countries. And here we recognized in most of the countries the huge role played by developmental finance. In other words, finance that's discounted through a national facility. This is not everyone running with a bright idea to a bank asking for funding. And there were very deliberate reasons behind this, because we're looking at development over time, not a quarter by quarter response in terms of how your investment is doing. And to do that, you've had ups and downs. And I think from the slides that the colleagues have presented earlier, you've seen this. This is not a seamless march upwards. And because of that, the type of financing and the type of custodian role played by developmental finance is extremely important. Extremely important. So you don't get caught out in those market responses. The last bullet point there, which is the book that we published in the middle of last year, all of these are available by Routledge. You can also find all of the books available for free download. That's part of the agreement we made. I'll make a point about how we should disseminate and share research. You'll notice from some of the colleagues a lot of the sources being mentioned. And I have to share a small anecdote with you. When we moved from development poles in their hoods to studying national systems in the 5 countries, we met in a very much colder place. It was in the northern end of Denmark, a place called Aalborg. And our colleagues from Denmark decided to help the Brics along. They'd present us with some data sets. And so they put up data sets. They were IMF data sets, they were World Bank data sets. And we spent the entire morning contesting numbers within the data sets that were being presented. This is an important thing for all of us. Who's measuring us? And how useful is their measurements of us? So one of the points that we've agreed to, and this is strongly supported within Brics itself, and that is our data must be increasingly generated by ourselves. In generating our own data, we are also sharing maybe new metrics by way through which we hope to maybe counter some of the negative effects of growth just on its own. Yeah? And this is not possible if you use the metrics whose only object is growth, which is GDP-orientated metrics. So be aware of that. We place a lot more emphasis around being well yeah, and development. In all of these 5 volumes that were produced, yeah, we acknowledge the role played by growth, but the role played by growth not for growth's sake, but for development's sake, improving the quality of those living in the territories that we study. Yeah. Which led us to the 6th volume, which was published at the beginning of this year, and there we looked at health, the health in the Brics countries, and systems of health. And there we found there was a lot of differences. It's not just between Chinese traditional medicine, Indian Ayurvedic systems. What we hope through this is to show the importance of local areas and their capabilities of engaging with health matters. So again, a small anecdote to help make this clear. The South African case study were written by 2 colleagues, Lindile Ndebeni and Erica Kramer-Mbula. They studied 3 district municipalities in the Eastern Cape. And their findings ran counter to the policy approach. And I'm going to, because of time, just make this much shorter, but please be encouraged. Write to me and we'll share with you the documents. A policy response to the lack of health care is to build hospitals and to build clinics. I'm sure this helps the way in which people measure growth. But the reality of huge numbers of people separated by vast distances with very unreliable transport nodes between them means that we have to maybe relook at how we think about having people access health and medicine. And to this extent, what we found was a critical role, especially in those municipalities, those district municipalities, of the role played by traditional healers. It's only when traditional healers fail to resolve problems that people then look for, you can say, the conventional or mainstream health system. So a policy response, which we hope, this is out in discourse and we are engaging, especially with that locality, is improving the capabilities for diagnosis amongst the traditional health providers. And this is already starting to bear fruit, just in terms of getting people to think a little differently. And that's the part I'm going to emphasize in all of the Brics work that we've done. What the Brics open for us is alternatives. In other words, not conforming to a thing called the Washington Consensus. Quite surprised no one's mentioned it. From our start in the year 2000, the work that we've done is not only against the Washington Consensus, but seeking to allow development to take place without the negative effects of that consensus on us. So, in a more formal way, since South Africa's entry into BRICS, I can't pronounce the Russian name at the conference where South Africa was included. But since then, we operate within at least 2 levels. There are a whole range of BRICS meetings taking place. But the one that attracts us most and that we are part of is the academic stream. And the object of the academic stream is to build our public intellectual capabilities by working together. I'm emphasizing this. It's not so that we get consulting firms to represent us in these meetings. It's about building our public universities through this interaction. It's a very important lesson again, yeah, as opposed to a Brookings or one of the other groups representing us through data that they make about us. Yeah. So at the academic forum, the one hosted by our colleague sat right here in front in Durban, the economic section of the program essentially spoke about global developmental potentials. And this is the context within which South Africa introduced an innovation. And that innovation was bringing our neighborhood into the meeting. Yeah. Subsequent to the BRICS meeting in Durban, all of the subsequent BRICS meetings have included the neighboring countries to BRICS as part of the formal summit process. And this is hugely important, again, about what we're trying to build. I'm trying to pose this to you, that we are not looking at catching up. That's a contrast to what exists as possibilities within BRICS, should we wish to grasp it. Yeah. So the following academic forum, the economic section was quite skewed towards information and communications technologies. And there were very specific reasons why we raised it in the context of the economy. This is not just, again, the hype of ICTs solves everyone's problems. What we were raising here were how some of the existing hegemonic countries utilize ICT for their own commercial benefits against international rules. Yeah? Again, there's detail within there, and you'll see from the publications what we were pointing to. Yeah? The president of Brazil, quite famously, turned down a reception at the White House because of the cyber spying on Brazil. Yeah? And a new charter is being formed within, and not only amongst BRICS, but globally, in responding to that. So this last BRICS academic forum, and just a few weeks back in Moscow, we held an additional forum, and that was on cyberspace and the global commons. Again, about safeguarding cybernetics and our communications that are taking place within it. Yeah? The world is not as easy a place, maybe, as sometimes we'd like to represent it as. Yeah? And the point that hopefully comes through in what I'm going to say is that it's up to us through the research activities to bring forward alternative narratives. Yeah. So in working with civil society, we've also engaged in research. And this research, at least these are the parts that we've been involved in, from what I've heard from your research agenda, there's a lot of coincidence. So we look at maybe working together on some of these, about developmental financing, where I can say, at least from the work that we did not succeed. And the development bank, the new development bank, carries with it a lot of normal banking. When we raised as an alternative, the response to us was direct. We only want a boring bank. Our response, and you can imagine this, it didn't go down very well. We've also worked on the notion of urban inequality, and then specifically on Henry Lefebvre's right to the city and BRICS, talking about democracy, participation, and ownership in that context. So, maybe pay attention to the hand on the side. This was a metaphor raised with us by the head of the Chinese delegation, and spoke to, instead of thinking just about fists, the 5 countries should increasingly start doing more work, not comparing each other to each other. And this is the point I'm raising with you as well. Not city to city only, but what do we have to learn in common? And how can we, through learning together, and those, out of all of those 15 years of research, these are just the points we pulled down. History matters, you know this, you've heard it in various ways. Context matters specifically, and especially while, it doesn't matter if you're number 2 in GDP ranks, the trilateral system still exists, and advanced and mature capitalism is not giving way. There's a lot more work to be done. Scale is important, and this plays to the Brics' favor. Yeah? But to make use of these scales better, we should not lose faith in heterodox approaches as opposed to merely validating the orthodoxies. Yeah? And for that, we must move beyond official. And I can raise a lot when you bring questions about this. We waste a lot of time merely following protocols as opposed to genuinely engaging as societies, as enterprises, and as academics. So, my conclusions here. And I'd really encourage, as this program develops, we need to do much more. It's not just about the government's meeting. We have to do much more to encourage the peoples of these territories to engage more. They are doing it already, but not officially through Brics. We need to do much more to bring that about, facilitating institutional collaboration as well. We have a lot to learn from our own developmental experience. Yeah. You know, there's something which people don't like mentioning. It's behind the G77 plus China. Yeah. And that is the non-aligned movement. Yeah. And in a lot of the work that we do, at least within my institute and the spheres of influence that we occupy, we place a lot of emphasis on that perspective relative to following the line and catching up with the ones devastating the planet. We have to ensure participation as well. This isn't just about elites. And this is odd coming from academia. But we need to encourage more and more participation. And I mean this, if you think of a hierarchy with universities as tertiary institutions, what do we do about school kids? And I don't mean just learning Mandarin. I mean this more in terms of the type of projects that our school kids are imagining and the extent to which Brics can help contribute to making that maybe better pictures of the future. Must ensure wider dissemination of our research results. We have to ensure all that we produce is in the public domain. We had a huge problem as South Africa relative to our first representations at the 2 Brics summits. We don't have all the documentation. Since the 3rd summit, we have been working as public universities, which means all the work that comes out of these summits is publicly available. Yeah? And then the last point I want to make here is really, maybe Santon doesn't make you feel this way, but the world is not in a good place. The world as a whole. The one planet that we can call home. The reason for it is the combined and uneven form that our development has taken. Within that, we don't only have losers, but we have winners. A lot of our research work, whether you call it pro-poor or development-orientated, focuses on those losing. I think we need to afford ourselves an opportunity to talk about those winning and how they are preventing us from achieving a better life for all. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really wonderfully provocative and extremely helpful, extremely useful in thinking through quite a complex territory. So this is really a long session. I don't know who invented the 2:30 to 6 p.m. sessions. It's a long session, so let's just take a breather. Let's just reflect a bit. And I'll give you an opportunity to take a stretch and just take a few comments, and then we'll have two final reflections. So there's just so much. From the last presentation, just how do we absorb and receive those benefits from, essentially, from the existence of this construct that we call the Brics? What we've heard about the importance of metrics, what we've heard about the importance of the alternative narratives, the heterodoxies, and there's so much richness we can take from this, and I really must thank you. I found it a very useful presentation, and really a very important invitation, in a sense, to partner in various of these Brics discussions and forums we're having, so thank you for that. There's really a debate around the meaning, the purpose of the Brics as a political construct, as an analytical construct, as the basis of a narrative, the countervailing narratives we've heard. Just going back to Margot's presentation, the comparative perspective, which puts us in perspective. We can think differently about ourselves if we understand that we're the 2% and not the 53%, and that our cities are really quite modest in the Brics terms, important but modest, and what does that mean, and how do we build partnerships in view of where we actually are. And then from Jade, the relational connections, and what was very interesting to me is the considerable energy that actually exists, that we're just not aware of because of our limitations in the field in which we structure ourselves. And just the energy that we can actually tap into, build on, and really think about how we should be exploring and understanding these multiple connections and linkages, and not only what exists, the possibilities. For Yen, it's really about the worlds we still understand so little about, and how important it is to get the window into those worlds. Of course, there are multiple windows, and one can talk very differently of China. It's a huge and complex country. But from at least from our disciplinary perspective of urban studies, to get a window into the world of urbanism in China, which we need in relation to all the other countries. But obviously there's some gaps in our discussion. So there is this danger of, I think someone talked about the Novo-Rich Club of the Brics. You know, the Brics is not everything, as the countervailing power to the North and the OECD countries. And so we need to broaden our discussion as well. What does the Brics mean for the other places in the Global South? And what are the connectivities between the Brics and the other places, so that the benefits are more evenly distributed? And so we haven't really had that discussion. Perhaps we'll have that discussion, the question in this dialogue now in the next hour or so, around particularly the connections with Africa. But let's have that discussion. And I'm sure these are just some of the insights I gained. I'm sure you gained other insights, so please share them with us. And let's just, while we're taking a break from presentations, just talk about the insights you've received, raise questions, raise debates you think we need to have. What haven't we discussed? Let's take a few points, hopefully. Yes, please, and just introduce yourselves.
My name is Anthony Sileta. I'm from the city of Johannesburg.
You know, maybe it's difficult to come up from the back, but you'll need to just raise your voice, and those who... Yeah, that helps, yeah.
Well, starting by appreciating all the input we had. More a question that we currently are having...
Sorry. For recording purposes, do you want to come up here? Okay, sorry, even if those at the back are still going to have to come around to the front. It's just for recording purposes, because the whole session has been recorded. Do we have a roving mic?
We don't have, I don't think...
Okay, you'll have to come up to the front. This is your opportunity. This is your great opportunity. Come to the front. And for recording purposes also, and for our interest, please introduce yourself. So introduce yourself again.
My name is Anthony Slep. I'm from the city of Johannesburg. By attempting to raise this question, I never thought I'd reach the podium. The point I want to ask from all who has presented and everybody else, provoked by this presentation, is that we are having China normalizing the new law from its growth point. We are having Russia and Brazil recovering from their problems, as you'll be having China and all focusing on their domestic India as well. Now, as countries, we know that in the immediate to medium term, they are having internal problems to deal with, both for growth and domestic response. My question to that is, as we are dealing with Brics cities, do we discount them from their sovereign problems as within those countries and talking about cities as networking amongst themselves, independent of their sovereign, which are seemingly having problems? And against that, do we think cities themselves could have capacity to respond to this kind of questions?
It's clear. That was a great question, by the way. It's a nice layering of questions, because the Brics, the official construction of the Brics was in terms of growth. And something different is happening now. It might not be decline, still 6.9% growth in China, the new normal, but it certainly is a lot more volatility and variability. But then it's also the question then of with these difficulties at a national scale, does that maybe provide an opportunity for city-to-city linkage, or is there another way of looking at it? And do we have the capacity actually to engage? It's a great question, but let's take other questions. You can ask the question. Would you like to ask a question in French? Could you come up to the front? You can pose the question in French. I'm not sure that everyone would be able to respond. Okay. Are there other questions? Is the translation working? This is working. Okay. Other comments? Other points? Okay. Then, would you like to respond? Would any of the speakers like to respond to the questions that were raised? Please, Jed.
Thank you. I think when you think about internal issues as if it's sort of cut off from everywhere else, but if you think about many African countries that are relying very heavily on what's termed aid, but is often a sort of business relationship that is constructed as part aid, part loans between China and Africa and Brazil and Africa, but that one isn't really isolated, I think, in this particular sense in terms of dealing with internal issues such as a need for infrastructure, a need for agricultural machinery, and in the past a need for medical practitioners. So that these other countries are often being drawn on to deal with internal issues, economic issues, health issues. And aid has always been pouring into Africa from other countries. So I wonder how truly separate, and how really internal one is in dealing with one's own issues across Africa. And I'm just putting it out there, and maybe others want to add to this who've got more knowledge than I. Okay, thanks.
So I think there is a conversation, we might not be able to have it successfully this afternoon, but about the nature of those engagements and how we leverage those engagements in a constructive way. And if we can have that discussion, that's great, but let's at least put it on the table. Are there any other comments? If not, Arash, would you like to come forward? So we're having the heterodoxies and the orthodoxies and the official and the non-official discussions, and it's a great melting pot. So Rash will talk from maybe a personal perspective, maybe from the city, from Gauteng perspective. Rash will tell us.
Sorry about this. Okay, well, actually, Flo, I should say this, that I wasn't sure what to speak about, so I kind of just made it up as we're going along. I had a bit of a presentation, so because I think partially because there was it came in quite late, and also rest again. I think I must just sort of confess that in fact we spent the morning at JP Morgan releasing the latest Brookings report on competitiveness. So yeah, well, you're spot on, and of course, guilty as charged, neoliberal, whatever. But no, I mean, but I think that it's actually maybe I'll just digress for a moment. Sorry, because I think it is part of the discussion. What Brookings was able to do was to benchmark the Gauteng city region against 5 other equivalent sort of city regions across the world in terms of 3 metrics of competitiveness. And of course, I mean, there were actually, it was just an analytical piece. I mean, there were no real policy implications as such. And I mean, the point about all of these things is that, well, we weren't actually launching, we were just participating in the discussion. And I think that from our point of view, the insights that we actually gain through that kind of comparative stuff is really important. So, in the same vein, I mean, that's a kind of issue that I want to basically pick up on. Let me find. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Oh yeah, just to say that I just wanted to talk about connecting Brics city regions and not just Brics cities. So that's my sort of take home, Margot, because you said Johannesburg is 10 million people. I was corrected by Councillor Naidu who said Johannesburg. I know you said Witwatersrand, but you see that's the problem because it's actually you see the kind of difficulties that we get into, but we'll talk to it as we go along. I know you said Witwatersrand, but you see Johannesburg is not equal to Witwatersrand. Anyway, Mayor Tao said yesterday, according to the latest, actually 5 million, not 4, 5. Anyway, okay, I'm not trying to score points, if that's what you think. Okay, so look, I mean, there are many large cities around the world, cities in excess of 1 million people, and you can see again the concentrations in China, India and so on, Europe and North America that obviously have very, very high levels of urbanization. But really the focus is on city regions. Again, I think we may find the idea somewhat nebulous and I think maybe not lacking the kind of conceptual clarity that we're looking for, but there's an idea which we're basically pursuing. And I think it came through very clearly in Jens' presentation, the distinction between city regions and super city regions or something. And those, I mean, those are beyond, I mean, the ones in China are really not what we're talking about, the really mega ones. But of course, there are a spectrum of different kinds of cities. Global city regions are not just mega cities in excess of 10 million, because you may well have cities that are large, but don't have a number of other sort of characteristics that we're actually looking for. So the one is economic specialization, and so there's a kind of or even economic sort of diversity in some ways. So not just a city which has a sort of a single monofunctional kind of economic profile. Connectedness, so connectedness in every sense, in terms of air transport, in terms of, speeds and so on. Agglomeration, the active presence and concentration of enterprises. Interestingly enough, economic and social elites. I thought that was actually an interesting point to make. That in fact you have your elites who are located there. Center or centers of decision making. So it's not only political decision making, but it's also economic decision making, and even things like social and cultural production that we heard about earlier on. Government institutions and supporting infrastructure. So those are sorts of issues in some senses that we're actually talking about. Global city regions actually don't necessarily end up being sort of megacity regions that are governed under one authority. I mean, like I think Yen's example of those cities like Beijing and Shanghai and Chongqing and so on, which are all like they're sort of city region provinces type of arrangements, right? So and they have that's a clear sort of governance arrangement or government arrangement, should I say. But there are a number of other ways in which you can actually say, okay, you've got a big complex place, and how do you actually begin to cooperate? But I'm not going to go into this detail. Some of this is a bit dated, possibly. It's a very old slide that I found from somewhere. So, but it does give you some sense of particularly in the middle column, of the kind of different arrangements that one could have. Now, moving to South Africa. So there's this confusion about the abbreviation GCR. So sometimes it's global city region. In this case, in the way that we popularized it more recently, we're talking about the Gauteng city region. So just to be clear about that. And this is obviously the kind of big purple blob in the northeastern part of the country is what we call the Gauteng city region. I think it's a good comparison with other places. So look at the Western Cape and look at eThekwini and so on. They're actually nowhere near in scale. This is another representation done by the Gauteng City Region Observatory. What they've done is that they've actually looked at the proportion of the population and said if that was the amount of space that would be sort of equal amount of space per resident, that's what Gauteng would look like. We know Gauteng is 1.4% of the land area. Here it looks like the Northern Cape. So it gives you some sense. I think the other thing is that we're heading towards a quarter of the country's population. In fact, like a few years ago, we were like 1/5, and we slowly. I mean, every time there are mid-year estimates, we actually get closer to the kind of 25% mark, which is actually really significant and important. I mean, it's more of a sort of like a psychological point, and say we are a quarter of the country's population, but the usual thing about generating in the order of 35% of GDP. If we zoom in, the idea of the Gauteng city region is there have been long debates about it, and what does it mean? Well, in one sense, it means the wider footprint of the functional economic entity, which is not just the province of Gauteng. And so you see the stuff, in the northwest, the platinum mines, the coal mines of the western part of Mpumalanga, and actually just across the road from the river is Sestelburg. So that gives you a sense, but actually for our purposes, let's not confuse it, because in a way, there are debates about that, but for example, the super region idea, I don't think we can really talk about that at all, but certainly the global city region idea that Yen was talking about, I think we can talk about that. Okay, that's just municipalities. Maybe just to say, and you can see this, I think the point to make, and this is actually the crucial point, that in fact, in Joburg, Ekurhuleni, and Tshwane, we're talking about over 10 million people. Right, and then the rest of the population are basically in the other parts, and they're kind of dispersed out. So what we have is really people living very close to each other, and that's the issue in a way about how we can define this sort of animal in some ways. And one of the points that I keep making, and now it's becoming a sort of cliche, but I'll make it again, and that is that the idea of building the Gauteng City region is actually saying, how do we begin the process from bottom up to basically relate to one another, so that we don't see ourselves as islands, you know, and because the borders are very porous. I mean, they actually, you know, it's like, you know, if you live in Bedford View, you say you live in Johannesburg. I know a lot of gangsters live there, you know, for some reason, I'm not sure why, but every kind of renowned gangster in Joburg actually lives in Bedford View and says in Joburg, but you know it's in the city of Ekurhuleni, not in the city of Johannesburg. So, I mean, that's just a technicality in some ways, in some senses, just where you're paying your accounts and where your ward councillor is and so on. And if you live in a wealthy place like Bedford View, you don't really care who your ward councillor is, by the way. And research does actually prove that, but that's another issue. So okay, but you get the point about, I'm saying the financial, I mean the economic, the spatial and transportation and functional linkages that you have, particularly in the core of the city region, are basically crossing each other in all the time. I know I always get into trouble with if there's people from City Bang or the West End and so on, but I mean, I think that there are significant numbers of people. You know, another way of looking at it is that like there may be between 2 and 3 million people in that band, the sort of the west, southwest band kind of thing, and that by any kind of calculation is a lot of people. So let's bear that in mind. We're not sort of like, you know, cutting our links to them, but we're just saying how do we practically begin to integrate. But of course we have serious problems. So we've got issues around. I mean, this is the land use, and you can see the sprawl beginning to happen. So the purple, the black colors are basically what we saw just before democracy, and the sort of purplish or pinkish colors are basically what we see, what we've seen more recently. We also know that and I know Phil's outfit has done research on the periphery. So, but this is a GCRO map which looks at poverty, and certainly on the outskirts of the Gauteng province, you see the very highest levels of poverty. And there are, as I said, significant concentration of poverty. So the opposite map this is actually about access to employment. So the red peaks that you basically seeing are where the key economic nodes are in Gauteng. So you can see the poverty. Oh, oops. Okay, right. And I mean the other point maybe is to say that. This is the point around the transport interlinkages. Now this is trips, commuter trips for white respondents, and you can see the lines are very much across the borders. Not and that's one of the issues. And if you look at it for Africans, it's more intense but certainly more extensive as well. So it's kind of a bit of both. So people are, I mean, a lot of people are also living close to work, but a lot of people are also crossing very, very, very vast distances as well. And those little blue dots are the kind of key economic nodes, points of origin and departure. Okay, so I mean, I don't want to kind of prove the point about the idea of our interconnectedness, but I think to kind of understand it graphically is actually important as well. So what's happened when Premier Makura arrived about a year and a half ago? He basically kind of reinvigorated the concept of the Gauteng City region and said, actually, he really thinks that as an idea to begin to understand or to facilitate cooperation, not that there's no cooperation, but to actually enhance the existing levels of cooperation, sometimes disjuncture as well, let's be clear about that, among certainly the metros, but also the districts and so on within Gauteng. And in a couple of respects. So the one is research, and probably our best example of very successful research entities is the Gauteng City Region Observatory. is doing fantastic work. It's funded mainly by the provincial government, but it's based at Wits University, also is part of UJ. So good example of a sort of, what do they call them, triple helix, double helix kind of relationship and so on. But it's not there just to kind of feed the sort of the policy mill. It's also, we like DA members of the legislature and so on, deputy president, all sorts of people use it because the data is legitimate. And I think that's an important kind of non-partisan way of actually cooperating. So this we consider to be like a very important success. By the way, the universities also claim this is a big success. So, but it's fine. I mean, I think that's really the issue. The second is that from a government point of view, is there a unified agenda? And this is something, in other words, where there's a kind of a base commonality, if you like. No, I mean, we don't do all identical things in Joburg and Tshwane and so on, but at its most fundamental, if we want to cooperate, can we be doing very similar things? So that's what I mean by a unified agenda. And that's, I'm not going to go into the detail because there's a long story around that, but I think that's something that we're working towards. Also at the level of planning, and really, from what I was saying earlier on about transportation planning, spatial planning, clear need to actually cooperate. Economic development cooperation, I mean, it's absolutely essential. The report that we were launching this morning, I mean, there were some good ideas there on a global basis where you have this sort of growth coalitions, or which we don't really have, and I think that could be something that could enhance our work. And then governance and institutional relationships. So it's beyond just your normal government stuff like national, provincial, local government is in the constitution. How do we further forge new relationships? So okay, this is the Gauteng City region, and how do we begin to think about that in relation to other Brics cities? I think that it's I don't know, a very thin slide, but I think it's something that we want to kind of begin to figure out. Part of the thing is, and that's precisely the research that we're going to be doing, or that Phil and his outfit will be doing in the next couple of months. And I think certainly what we heard earlier from Margot and Yen, I think certainly is the sort of stuff that we're talking about. But also, I mean, I think what firstly, the issue around African city regions, I think might be an interesting thing. There aren't many case studies, so can we begin to think about that? Does Lagos represent a city region the way, if there's a kind of a commonality across it, or Cairo or Kinshasa or whatever? So I think that that might be important. And then obviously in relation to other Brics city regions across the world. The areas of focus is like the multiplicity of governance arrangements. I mean, it's not just government sort of constitutional arrangements. It's also how do you kind of work together and so on. I mean, I can tell you, about 6 or 7 years ago, we did a study tour to Brazil to look at the ABC region in Sao Paulo. And we discovered to our horror when we got there that actually the city of Sao Paulo is not part of the ABC region. It's all the surrounding municipalities. So actually, it's the epicenter of the Sao Paulo wider metropolitan region was basically out of it, and the rest of them were in. Not very helpful, but it's, I suppose, a kind of reverse lesson. So it's those kinds of things that I think we can learn from one another. Then economic relationships, the opportunities. Again, I think, whether it's a valid conceptual kind of category or something is a metaphor, but we've got it, so let's see if we can kind of make it work. Cultural exchange, learning from one another, and so on. And then I think just the area of research that I've been talking about. So, Phil, those are some of my thoughts for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rush. And I think the lesson is clear that if you change the geographic scale, you change your perspective quite dramatically. So the scale at which you look at city issues is really important. Of course, there are lots of complexities. And so the question of if the Gauteng city region is a cluster of interconnected cities, what are the cities? What is Joburg? Because it can't just be the municipality and so on. It might not be the Witwatersrand. These things are important, but we don't have to get into those specificities now. But they are also important in terms of comparability. So maybe, Rash says, maybe the super mega regions of Gauteng or just of China are just beyond our frame. But actually, maybe that's the closest comparison we have, because those are clusters of cities, and the way that Gauteng is, maybe it's just a difference of scale. So, I mean, these are things that we need to talk through and think through, and they're not particularly easy. But let's hear from eThekwini, which is definitely an urban agglomeration. It may not be a cluster of cities, but it is definitely an important urban agglomeration. Thank you very much, Eric.
Need to connect here.
While we're connecting, if anyone does have a particular question for Rash. Okay, then let's just sort of wait for the connection.
It's a bit tight here. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I know this is like a difficult shift. You had lots of death by PowerPoint, a lot of information. But I'm going to take you through a lot of images and stuff about my city and we are a Brics friendship city, and I want to focus on how we've participated. We're a fairly large city. We are 2,207 square kilometers. We are 3.5 million people. We are 68% rural. We have a budget of about 40 billion. That's about 2.3 billion euro. We have 205 elected councillors. We have 103 wards. We have 23,000 people that work for us. And we have 15 sister cities across the globe. And on the continent, we have some very strategic cities. But in addition, we also have the Brics Friendship Cities, which I'll show you in a moment. So the first meeting of the Brics Friendship City was in China. We had another one in Mumbai. So we've come to the point, the last one was in St. Petersburg. And at each of those Brics Friendship Cities, we included other regions or other cities within the Brics cities. Now, very importantly, the Brics conference held in Durban in 2013. Our president took it upon himself to have a separate meeting of all the African heads of state at that Brics conference. And that is where they looked at the partnership between how Brics has a relationship with the whole continent. And actually next week there's a big China-Africa forum here in Johannesburg. So the Brics Friendship Cities is an important platform which came out of the Brics movement to say how can cities cooperate. So 4 cities from Brics initially, Rio, St. Petersburg, Mumbai and Qingdao, established a partnership in 2008. Durban joined them later after South Africa became a member in 2010. The underlying rationale of cooperation is that the Brics can learn useful lessons about the relationship between growth, poverty reduction and urbanization from each other. So, I mean, this is just a repeat of what I've said, but I think the key things here is about cooperation, Brics cities being partners, and working. And one of the resolutions that came out of the Brics friendship cities in Russia, in St. Petersburg, the governor, or you'd call him the mayor of St. Petersburg, was saying, we as Brics cities should look at having our own Brics financial institution as cities to look at infrastructure projects. So this was the Brics Friendship Cities held in Durban in 2013. And just to say something about Brics, I think, I don't want to read, I'm sure this must have been covered in other presentations, is the issue of how many people live there, in terms of economic growth, the shifting economic growth from the north to the south, and most Brics cities are in the south, and really looking at the amount of trade and investment, the amount of trade that's being done between between the Brics cities. And it's a very important, and it's important in the world to be disruptive. Don't always rely on the IMF and the World Bank to have all your solutions. Create new platforms and create competition. That's something is healthy for development. So these are the partner cities that we've partnered with in terms of the Brics. Rio, Mumbai, St. Petersburg and Qingdao. Oops, it's stuck here. And this is just one of the cities. We have a formal sister city agreement we signed before Brics came to. But this relationship with the city of Guangzhou has really helped Durban. And we are both, and what we've always strived to do is have partnership with port cities. And the Brics agreement actually gave us that opportunity to be partners with these port cities. And as you know, Guangzhou is a very important strategic, as the presentation was done earlier. So what we're doing is we are looking at how do we cooperate on maritime issues. Operation Pakise in South Africa is one of our strategic economic drivers going forward. And we need to say, how does our port city corporations help us? For example, the Russians are looking at how do we improve maritime education? How do we improve maritime technology? Because if we're going to have Operation Pakise, we need all that in place. We as South Africa don't have, and most of us, a lot of our cities on our continent don't have the number of skilled personnel and technology to really get the benefit of Operation Pakise or the ocean economy in particular. So the port of Durban, this slide shows you how we are beginning to expand the port. The T-jet here is mainly for citrus fruit export into Europe. The terminal here is for export, the automotive sector. So we're expanding the container handling capacity in the port, because in terms of the growth, and that Gauteng region, city region that's going to be developed, an efficient port in Durban and other ports is critical. So the port is expanding to meet the growing demand. This is the old international airport in the south of the city that's going to be converted into a second dig-out port, and that port will be focusing mainly on containers, liquid bulk and automotive. Oops, sorry. I think I'll press something. And these large vessels cannot come into our port. Our port, the depth of our port is only 11.9 meters. So these, and if you look at this company, Maersk is planning to buy and order 10 new 18,000 TEU vessels. And we've got to be able to be part of that process. The only port in South Africa is Kucha in the Eastern Cape. We're also improving the recreational and environmental management of our port. We've signed an agreement with the Dutch government to assist us with air quality issues around the port. I mean, air quality in the port, if you have odors that affect workers in the port, you have downtime, and it's bad for productivity, but it's also bad for people, I mean, in terms of their health. And we're also part of the Indian Ocean Port Cities Network, and all these port cities in the Indian Ocean, is our mayor is a vice president. It's called the Indian Ocean Observatory. We've had Al-Shabaab pirates attacking and being part of piracy movements in the Indian Ocean. We've had situations where there's been overfishing by both European, Asian, and African-based fishing companies. And we need to make sure the Indian government, the South African government, and the Mozambican government, and the French government are collaborating to ensure that there's more efficient management of our ports, and our ports are engines of economic growth. We also, in terms of the expansion of our airport, we're wanting to use the Brics network to say, how can we bring more airlines into our airport? We've invested lots of money in that airport. Currently, we only have Emirates, Turkish Airlines, and South African Airways. We're just about signing Ethiopian Airlines and Qatar and it's the bulk of it is going to be on cargo. The turnaround time of fruit and vegetables and technology can't sit in a ship for 2 weeks. They've got to be on time, at your desk, in your shop. So our airport is about goods and people, and also it's about young people. How do we get young people exchanging ideas in the IT field? We've got a program called Smart Exchange. Sorry. And in terms of inner city regeneration and looking, a lot of our cities have developed, and they went through periods like Johannesburg and a lot of cities around the world. And how do we look at sharing ideas of dealing with urbanization, with inner city crime and grime, to really create new economic zones where economic activity has changed. So in terms of disaster management, we're sharing our disaster management technology and expertise with our colleagues in the DRC. And this is a very interesting project that we're working on at the moment. And also, because we are over 60% rural as a municipal area, how do we learn with our Brics cities about agribusiness, about promoting agriculture? And really, as a city, we're striving to do that. A number of programs. This is a program that we're sharing with the Indian government, and they're looking at soya bean production. I didn't realize you could make so many things with soya beans. My wife is vegetarian, so she gives my son soya hot dogs, soya sausage hot dogs. Even my poor dog has been converted to eat soya bean sausages. And waste management is something that is an important area that we're sharing knowledge on. Is around how do we manage our landfill sites, how do we manage air quality and water quality issues. And we've also sharing this technology with our Brics partners around using your decommissioned landfill sites to create waste from energy from waste. And recycling is something that we're pushing in our city. And this is a very interesting project. In 2008 and this year, we had dreadful xenophobia in our city. Attacks on particularly African migrants. And that's another thing is, how does Brics cities work together to manage and deal and prevent the negative impacts of migration? In South Africa, we've been able to, we got the Muslim community, the Christians, the Hindus, the Jews, and government to work together to create a community center where people can get services, refugees in particular. So in terms of transport, that's another important thing. South Africa is going through a rapid development process of putting in new public transport models. And we are looking at systems in Johannesburg, they call the Rapid Revire. And we've got a program called Go Durban. We'll be modernizing our stations, putting in new systems of public transport lanes. And really we want to avoid traffic jams. And really it's about reducing our carbon footprint. Our mayor is encouraging us to walk in the city. He wants us to do non-motorized transport, particularly cycling. There's our mayor cycling. And also the issue of the use of solar energy. In terms of the Brics cities, we need to be investing more. I mean, here on the continent, we have huge volumes of sun, but we're just not using it enough. And so we're really trying, with the city of Sao Paulo, we've done very huge exchange programs with them, particularly on social housing programs, on ideas of how you improve housing delivery in the favelas of Sao Paulo and in our informal settlements in Durban. We'll also be developing an international sports academy. We'll be hosting the Commonwealth Games in 2022. So we're really looking at what we can do to save money by not building new. How do we build what we have already? Our mayor is also very involved in UN sustainability, particularly dealing with the issues of climate change. And he leaves this evening, leaves us here, goes to Paris. Because cities have a very important message and agenda at COP21 in Paris. We also have this is a program that we would like to offer to the cities network, to Africities. We have a program called MILE. It is part of a number of international platforms. We partners with the United Cities for Local Government. And I think the whole Brics exchange and learning and opportunity should come into this, all the platforms we have within the Africities Forum. And we have one called MILE, and we have a number of master's programs where we do both practical and fieldwork and theoretical stuff with city managers, with councillors, with civil society partners, people who are dealing with challenges facing cities around the world. And we have partnerships with our institutions of higher learning through the Municipal Institute for Learning. We also have a program called Imagine Durban, where it works with civil society to really look at long-term development planning. We have a Sustainable Cities Expo every year, and we want to encourage, we've actually got a pavilion for African cities that can come and do joint ventures or partnerships there. We're also part of ICLEI, the Global Cities Network of dealing with climate change. And this is another platform that we are also using our Brics membership to put the agendas of climate change there. I mean, today if you saw Sorry, almost done. Okay. So we also have a number of programs dealing with climate change, like reforestation, control of alien invasive plants, controlled fires, and that's my presentation. I'll take some questions. Thank you. So I was told 15 minutes, so I was kind of timing myself wrongly then. Sorry. Okay.
It was entirely inadvertent that this was the last presentation. We didn't get to that level of detail, but I'm glad it was, in the sense that we got down to something really tangible, to see what some really concrete partnerships may be. So the idea of partnering with a port city that can really produce joint learning and can offer lessons, presumably eThekwini can offer lessons also for Guangzhou, I think is really exciting. So this shows that we're not just talking in the ether. By building these knowledge exchanges, we can direct learning into something very tangible. Thank you very, very much. So are there any specific questions then to Eric, before I ask if there's any final general comments you want to make? Again, it was very clear, so thanks very much, Eric. Yes, there's a question there. Do you want to come to the front, please?
No, it's not a question. I think that can be heard.
No, it's because of the recording. Do you mind coming to the front?
No, thanks. My name is Tapelo. I'm from Salga. I was saying that maybe the question by the gentleman from Johannesburg has been answered by the presentation made by the gentleman from Durban. Maybe what needs only to happen is that those city friendships need to be expanded to other cities in the country so that they can engage. But I think an extensive process is already in place in terms of consultation and so forth.
Thanks. That's a helpful point, because one of the questions, do we have the capacity to engage? Well, certainly around some very concrete initiatives, it's clear that our cities do have the capacity to engage. I guess it's hard to deal with it. We've angled the topic from so many different directions, and it's hard to deal with everything. I still think that perhaps one area that we will need to explore into the future is more broadly the relationships with cities in Africa. So we've had something very, very specific about eThekwini, which was great. But you might know, for example, that China is building a special economic zone outside Lagos, which is going to have a huge impact on Lagos. I don't know positive, negative, what the consequences will be. I haven't understood it properly. You'll know that the Chinese are investing heavily in new urban transport systems in Addis Ababa. There's the new light rail system, which has recently opened, and so that impact is important, and particular models are being connected. You'll know about significant links, not only China, Brazil, and Angola. There's a very significant linkage. Russia is behind the building of many new towns in Africa. Renaissance Capital, which is a big Russian investment company, is actually having a major impact on the urban form in Africa. Even significant investments in South Africa. I could talk about Shanghai's investments in Joburg and so on. It's not only investments, as we heard from Jade, it's about many other forms of connection, particularly exchange of ideas and discourses and other practices. So there's so much more that we could discuss. It's such an important topic, I think, and we've only begun to scratch the surface. And of course, we shouldn't only be talking about Brics, but it's a way into the discussion. And so a country like Indonesia is such an important country, or Mexico City, one of the biggest, most significant cities in the world. And so the discussion could continue. I'm also very aware, because of Salga's representation here, I'm really glad that the chairperson of Salga, and Salga's also here, because we've been talking really just about the big cities, and that's important. But there's cities of many different scales in Africa, in the Brics countries. In India, for example, most of the current urban growth is not happening in the mega cities, it's happening in a second and third tier of cities. And so we shouldn't just assume that it's about big cities to big cities. And so we need to also understand the different scales and the different forms of relationships. So before I ask, in fact, the chairperson of SALGA to conclude, and executive mayor of an important city but at a different scale, are there any other points that anyone would like to capture in our discussion? I'm not sure if we're going to get to the point of resolutions unless anyone wants to propose a resolution, except that this is important. We need to engage further, build the partnership. But if you do wish to propose a resolution, certainly do that. But are there any other critical points you would like to make? Yes. Please. We don't have earphones, so we may need someone who's French speaking to translate to us all. There are headsets, but another way of doing it is just ask the translator to come from the box and translate to everyone. Could you do that? Thanks very much. Okay. If you could make the point in French, and then we'll get a translation for everyone, please. And if you could ask him to come to the front. Okay. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
C'est Monsieur Moussa Abdul Razak.
My name is Moussa Abdul Razak.
Je suis l'un des maires de la ville de Kinshasa, République démocratique du
I'm one
Congo.
of the mayor of the city of Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Je suis heureux d'apprendre qu'il existe une organisation qui s'appelle Brics.
I'm so happy to hear that there is an organization called Brics.
Mais dommage, on a eu vraiment des problèmes techniques en français là pour comprendre
But
mieux la teneur de la
unfortunately,
chose.
we had a technical issue problem and we couldn't understand, the translation. And we were busy translating. We thought they could hear us, but they weren't hearing us.
Mais sinon, pour le peu que j'ai ouï entendre,
So for the little things that I've managed to understand,
j'ai appris que la République sud-africaine fait partie des États qui se trouvent dans les Brics.
I heard that the Republic of South Africa is among the members of BRICS states.
Maintenant, ma question est de savoir, est-ce
My
que
question is,
il n'y a que l'Afrique du Sud qui est dans cette organisation,
is there only South Africa in this
en Afrique,
organization?
bien
BRICS
sûr,
in Africa, of course.
ou alors il y a d'autres États africains
Or there are other African states
qui
that
sont
are
dans
also
l'organisation.
members of, BRICS.
Premier volet de ma question.
That's the
Deuxième
first
volet, c'est
dimension
que
of my question. The second dimension of question.
est-ce que cette organisation
Is this
est
organization,
fermée ou bouclée comme les G7 ou les GC6, tout ça, ou alors il est ouvert aussi pour
is
d'autres États?
this a closed organization like G7 and so forth, or it's an open one? That's my question.
Thank you. This touches the heart of some critical questions that I was trying to get us to discuss. Let's get him so we can get the translation. Thank you very much, and we're very honored to have the Mayor of Kinshasa with us. And it's a pity that language divides to the extent that it does and makes communication a bit difficult, but we're really grateful that you have sat through our session and have been willing to engage with us. So currently, the BRICS has a close membership. It's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But the BRICS has an intention to expand its membership, and it's talking at its next session of looking at other candidate members. So currently there's only one member in Latin America, that's Brazil, but we know that Argentina, we know that Mexico, Chile, Colombia and other countries are really significant countries, even globally, and they would surely be candidate members. In South Asia, India is the candidate member, but there are other significant countries as well, and China and East Asia and South Africa currently in Africa. So yes, currently it is a closed membership, but hopefully will be an expanding membership. But the critical issue is how does South Africa's membership of the BRICS benefit the rest of Africa? And that's what we need to talk about. How does Brazil's membership of the BRICS benefit the rest of Latin America? And that's why a discussion between Kinshasa and eThekwini, Kinshasa and Johannesburg is really important, because it becomes an exclusive club, a very limiting club, if South Africa only gets the benefit from being a member of the Brics. And so I think this is a critical point of discussion, but not necessarily a discussion we can talk through fully this afternoon. So thank you very much for your question. It's an important question. Are there other points? Could you come to the front, please?
Good afternoon. Thanks, Program Director. I'm Patrick Maisha, based here in the city of Johannesburg. I'm one of the PR councillors. I'm the whip for finance. My question is, actually my understanding of us coming together as this forum is that we need to try to be as innovative as possible after this particular exercise. Now, the presentation somewhere went to the effect that as South Africa, there are certain ports that cannot accommodate certain sizes of ship. And that really worried me as I was sitting down there. To say, once we have discovered this, are we therefore saying the human mind cannot stretch to a level wherein all the ports can be transformed to accommodate those sizes? I'm very worried, because the presenter only said, as South Africa is only one port in the name of Kucha that can accommodate. And now therefore say, then we'll need a lot of intensive network from Kucha to other cities. And we are encouraging in South Africa to make sure that you work within a short distance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eric, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think I can't speak for Transnet, and that's the Transnet's agenda, and they are a key parastatal in our country driving development agendas. And I think Kucha was a huge investment, and the reason for that investment was that it will be South Africa's premier deep water port. But the geography and the current location of our ports, I'm not sure if that's something that Transnet has to look at. From the Durban point of view, our geography and our port at the moment, as we can't reach that level in the next few years. It requires a lot of dredging and a lot of technical and investment in dredging and redesigning of your port to make it deeper. Okay. But that's a Transnet. I don't want to speak for them, but I think they've got plans. But can I just...
Can we come back to the resolution?
Oh, okay, no problem.
Thanks. I'll call you up. Let me just get other questions. By the way, one of the reasons why comparative research is important, it opens up new ways of thinking. Shanghai, you'll know, sits in the Yangtze River Delta. It doesn't have deep water. It's a massive city that has no big port. And so instead of saying, well, there's nothing we can do, Shanghai decided to build a bridge 20 kilometers out to sea, and build the port 20 kilometers out to sea. So you fly into Shanghai, you see this extraordinary bridge that goes 20 kilometers to the port, into the deep water. I'm not saying that eThekwini should do that. But let me just say if there's any other issues, concerns. So we did say that we'd think about resolutions if any comes to mind. I think Eric has got a proposal. Do you want to at least present your proposal, see what people say?
Yeah, my proposal stems from the fact that as Durban we've had the benefit of being a member of the Brics Friendship Cities network. And I think I'd like to propose that the Africities conference, in particular its hosting organization, UCLG, puts a resolution to them to the effect that we need to find innovative ways of getting as many, in particular African cities, to become members and to be beneficiaries of the Brics Friendship Cities Cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Is there general support for that?
So cities and regions, sorry.
Cities and regions, as many as possible in Africa, to link up with the BRICS cities through the BRICS Urbanization Forum and the Friendship Cities Forum. So if someone can capture that, we can put that forward. And it's just finding that point of connection between the BRICS structures and cities of Africa might be the one specific concrete proposal that we can put forward. And the many other things that we have to follow up with, we will do in various forums and through various bilaterals. And so let me ask then both an executive mayor and the chairperson of SALGA just to conclude the session if he has reflections on the session. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Prof. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, as a mayor, and obviously as a politician, I was just waiting to get a resolution, that's all. And I can see there's no resolution. What you just told all of us is, look, wait. We still don't know what this BRICS animal is all about. We are studying it. So, thanks very much for that. But obviously it was an eye-opener when you looked into the presentation by our sister here, Yang, on Chinese cities and so on. The comparative analysis that we had is quite obviously important for us to understand what exactly we will be dealing with, and the practical experiences, the practical experiences that we are having with eThekwini. No, it's fine. Are quite helpful in the sense that at least we can now find a way of how we will be able to move forward. What is coming out clear from all this is much work is being done by our research institute. The issue now is how we harness that work into the BRICS fraternity, if I must call it that. That's the institution. All these other bodies, you have your UN Habitat that is looking into places of stay and so forth. You have AU commissions and so forth. And I think our resolution must be in such a manner, as it is now put forth, that in enhancing our capacity as part of our research program and also of providing solutions to common experiences, problems that we are faced with as the BRICS community, if I must call it that. We then need to have that coordinated body commission where we would then input these experiences that we all are having, because they can't just be there in academic institutions. They need to be practicalized into becoming solutions for the BRICS body. I think that's quite important. One or another, I'm proposing also that we find a way of doing that so that all the experts and people who are engaged with some of these difficult issues that we have to deal with, they can then come together under the BRICS body, whatever that body will be called, in dealing with this. I'm saying this because presently also at the AU level, as UCLGA and SALGA in particular, we have approached the AU body to say we need to have a commission body that will look into matters pertaining to local government, so that the challenges there, the problems there, can also be elevated into the agendas or the agenda of the AU. And I think in this regard also, we need to look into that type of a model where this research capacity because it's not only here at home in the south of South Africa, but also in terms of the BRICS countries, and bring them together and then be able to come with proper recommendations to the leadership at the states level from BRICS. And what also is coming out clear, and I think Prof has indicated that it's the sharing of experiences from those countries that in the BRICS family. How then will they be able to assist others in their own continents who are not necessarily members of BRICS? We have heard our colleague from Kinshasa, and Prof has also indicated about some major towns that also might be able, in terms of family linkages, assist, let me say, the BRICS family in shaping the future for this animal that we are trying to look into. And it is quite important what the agitator in the room came up with, that sometimes we lose focus, we want to catch up, that's the word to use. And in so doing, we the policymakers, we then come with wrong policy measures in trying to resolve problems, simply because we conceptually have learned from others, only to find that those solutions or policies that we come up with do not necessarily or are not necessarily the right reaction or solutions to our problems. Yes, BRICS obviously are the so-called South-South countries. Whatever the term academically, I would know what it means, but what I know is that it means it's non-European, not in the apartheid sense. Yes, just like this Nkosi, I see it's not that Nkosi from Etiquette, it's another Nkosi. But again, I'm saying, as the southern countries, we are faced with different challenges. The research and the comparative analysis that was given earlier is indicating rapid urbanization that we are finding in these countries, and the problems that we still have to deal with, inequalities and so forth, which are not necessarily the major problems when it comes to north or northern countries. So how then do we propose, or what type of recommendations then we come up for the BRICS family? But I think the main important thing is that we have this BRICS body. The main thing is, what then are we doing, we as members, member states and members who are also in the research fields and so on, doing in order to assist this body to be able to move forward, given the vision that it is having, and also the vision that the member states are having. Earlier I was stressing the point of building the Africa that we want. And I think the issue would be building the BRICS that would serve us better. And I think that is basically what really this exercise was all about. I think all the inputs that you have made and your participation. Kelebo, my prof, thanks very much.
Many thanks. Would we be agreeable to a resolution? We can word it more elegantly, that says something like, to enable us to deal more effectively with the challenges and possibilities of urban development and local government in Africa. We propose to strengthen relationships between cities in Africa and those in the BRICS cluster, including through direct participation of African cities in BRICS structures such as the BRICS Urbanization Forum and the BRICS Local Government Friendship friendship cities, something like that. We'll ask someone to look at the wording and make it more elegant, but if there's general agreement, yes, please.
So, it is in general agreement, but I would encourage you, to get cities to meet each other is difficult.
Yes.
You should encourage people to people connectivity as well.
Yes, and so maybe we'll slip in something. That's the more difficult one, is how that will happen. But formally one can have participation in Brics forums, but yes. Thank you very much. Please spend 5 minutes just filling in the evaluation forms. That we'd greatly appreciate that. I'm sure there'll be someone at the door collecting the forms. And thank you again to everyone.
Sure.